Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
On Christmas Eve, while we were all opening presents, my parents dropped a bombshell. They had cut me out of their will. But I had a little something under the tree for them. Too, a gift they never saw coming. Christmas at my parents' house was the same every year. And I mean exactly the same. Matching pajamas? Check. My mom forcing us to take group pictures by the tree before we could open presents? Check. My dad making his world-famous eggnog that no one liked but pretended to enjoy? Big check. I used to roll my eyes at all the cheesy traditions, but deep down, I kind of loved it. It felt like home. This year started out no different. I showed up with a tray of cookies from the bakery, because let's face it, I can't bake to save my life, and tried to join in the holiday spirit. My brother Greg was already there, sitting in his spot on the couch, smirking at me like he'd just won a private joke I wasn't in on. I brushed it off, figuring he was just being Greg. Presents were the highlight of the night, as usual. My mom handed them out one by one, with her annoying habit of narrating each gift. Oh, this one is from your dad and me. You're going to love it. I opened my presents, a nice sweater, some gift cards, and a weird candle that I think was regifted. It was fine. Nothing fancy, but I wasn't expecting much. Then, just as I was thinking about sneaking another cookie, my dad cleared his throat. "Everyone, can I have your attention?" he said in that voice he only uses when he's about to say something serious. You know the one. It's half stern, half condescending, like you're about to get a lecture. I figured he was about to do his usual end-of-year pep talk about staying focused and making the family proud. He loves those. But instead, he dropped a bombshell. "We've made some decisions about the estate," he started, glancing at my mom like she was his backup. "It's important you all know before the new year." I felt my stomach twist. I wasn't expecting any big surprises, but something about his tone made me uneasy. "We've decided to adjust the will," he continued, pausing for dramatic effect. "And as part of that, we've decided it's best to remove you, my name, from it." At first, I thought I'd misheard him. "Wait, what?" I said, laughing a little because I was sure this had to be a joke. But the room didn't feel like a joke. My mom stared down at her lap, her face tight with discomfort. My dad kept his eyes on me, firm but detached, like he was delivering bad news to an employee. And Greg? He had that smug look again, the one that screamed, I knew this was coming. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice a little louder now. My dad nodded, completely calm. "We've made the decision as a family," he said, like that somehow softened the blow. "It's not personal." "Not personal?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "You're cutting me out of the will, and it's not personal?" Greg finally chimed in, leaning back on the couch like he owned the place. "Don't act surprised. My name? You've always done your own thing. This isn't exactly shocking." That hit me like a slap in the face. I looked around the room, searching for some kind of support, some sign that this was a misunderstanding. But no one said a word. My mom still wouldn't look at me. My dad had already started rearranging the empty wrapping paper, like the conversation was over. And Greg? He just sat there smirking. "I don't get it," I said, my voice trembling. "What did I do? Is this about money? Because I don't care about the money. It's not about the money," my dad interrupted, his voice sharp now. "It's about trust." That word hit me like a punch to the gut. Trust? What was he even talking about? I felt like I'd been blindsided, like the ground had been ripped out from under me, and no one cared enough to help me back up. I tried to hold it together, but my hands were shaking. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way my mom avoided my eyes, or the way Greg's smirk had turned into an outright grin. I realized I wasn't going to get an explanation, not a real one anyway. They'd made their decision, and that was that. I grabbed my coat and my bag, muttering something about needing air. No one stopped me as I walked out the door into the freezing night. The sound of carolers in the distance felt like some cruel joke, like the universe was mocking me for ever thinking this night was going to be normal. As I drove home, the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. My own family had cut me out. No explanation, no warning, just gone. The worst part? It wasn't even the money I cared about. It was the fact that they'd all decided, without even talking to me, that I wasn't worth being part of their future. And that's when the anger started to creep in. Driving home that night, I replayed the conversation in my head over and over again. The word trust echoed in my mind like an accusation I couldn't understand. Trust? What did that even mean? What had I done to make my own family, my parents, think I wasn't trustworthy? When I woke up the next morning, it still didn't feel real. I stared at my phone for a long time, half expecting my mom to text me, apologizing for how everything had gone down. She always softened the blow after one of my dad's lectures, like it was her job to smooth things over. But my phone stayed silent. I debated whether I should call her, or even Greg. Maybe I was missing something. Maybe there was some misunderstanding. But every time I thought about picking up the phone, my dad's words came back to me. It's not personal. It's about trust. The coldness in his voice made my stomach churn. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, even if I didn't want to hear them. I called my mom first because I figured she'd be the easiest to talk to. She picked up on the second ring, her voice tight and hesitant. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, and I could tell right away she was bracing herself. "Mom," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to know. What did I do? Why did you cut me out?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, and for a second, I thought she might cry. But when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost detached. "We've made the decision as a family," she said, like she was reading from a script. "But why?" I pressed. "I'm your daughter. Don't I at least deserve an explanation?" "It's complicated," she said softly. "We just felt it was the right thing to do." "Who's we?" I snapped. "You and Dad? Or is Greg the one pulling the strings here?" Her silence told me everything I needed to know. When it became clear I wasn't going to get any real answers from her, I hung up and called Greg. He didn't answer at first, but I was nothing if not persistent. By the third call, he finally picked up. "What do you want?" he said, his tone dripping with irritation. "What do I want?" I shot back. "I want to know why my own family decided to cut me out without even telling me why. Care to enlighten me?" Greg laughed, a low, condescending sound that made my blood boil. "Oh, come on, my name. Don't act like you're the victim here. You've always done your own thing, like you didn't need the rest of us. Well, now you've got exactly what you wanted. Are you serious right now?" I said, my voice rising. "What does that even mean? When have I ever acted like I didn't need this family?" He sighed, like he was tired of explaining something obvious. "You've always been the outsider, okay? You never took the same path as the rest of us. You're always doing your own thing, living in your little bubble. You made your choices, and now you're living with them." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So, because I didn't live my life the way you all wanted me to, I'm just out?" "That's insane, Greg." "Is it?" He shot back. "You've always made it clear you don't care about the family business, or the traditions, or any of the crap Mom and Dad value. You can't have it both ways." "That's not true," I shouted. "Just because I didn't want to work at Dad's company doesn't mean I don't care about this family." "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before you started treating us like strangers," he said, his voice cold. "This isn't some big conspiracy, my name. You did this to yourself." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was wrong, but the line went dead before I could say another word. The next few days were a blur of anger, confusion, and sadness. I couldn't stop thinking about what Greg had said. Was I really the outsider? I'd always been close to my family growing up, but things had started to change after I moved out for college. I'd chosen a different path. A career my parents didn't really understand, friends who didn't fit into their mold. Still, I never thought it was enough to make them cut me out completely. Sure, we had our disagreements, but every family does. I never thought those little cracks could lead to a complete break. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It wasn't just about the will or the money. It was about what their decision meant. It meant they didn't see me as part of their future. It meant they'd been talking about me behind my back, making decisions without me. It meant they didn't trust me, even though I'd never done anything to betray them. By the end of the week, I knew I couldn't just let this go. If they were going to cut me out, then fine, I didn't need their money. But I wasn't going to let them rewrite the story of who I was or what I meant to this family. If they thought they could erase me, they had another thing coming. I didn't even bother saying a proper goodbye. The moment the words, "It's about trust," came out of my dad's mouth, I knew there was nothing left to say. I grabbed my coat and my bag, ignoring the awkward silence as I headed for the door. My mom called out after me, her voice thin and unsure, "Drive safe." I didn't respond. The cold air hit me like a slap as I stepped outside, but it felt better than staying in that room. My heart was racing as I climbed into my car, slamming the door harder than I needed to. For a few seconds, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the snow piling up on the windshield. My hands were shaking, my chest tight. I wanted to scream, to cry, to hit something, but instead I just turned the key in the ignition and pulled out of the driveway. The drive home felt surreal. The streets were empty, lit only by the glow of holiday decorations still strung up on houses. Normally, I love this time of year, the way the lights made everything feel magical, even when it wasn't. But that night, The decorations felt hollow, like they belonged to someone else's world. I couldn't stop replaying the night in my head. My dad's words kept echoing, each syllable sharper than the last. It's about trust. We've made the decision as a family. What the hell did that even mean? What had I done that was so unforgivable? Sure, I'd argued with my parents a few times. I'd rolled my eyes at Greg's obnoxious bragging more times than I could count. But none of it seemed big enough to justify this, to justify erasing me from their future. I started to think about the little things I'd ignored over the years. The way my parents always seemed to side with Greg in every argument. The way they'd subtly dismiss my career choices, even as they praised his every move. The way family discussions always seemed to happen when I wasn't around. Had this been building for years, and I just didn't see it? By the time I pulled into my driveway, my anger was burning hotter than the hurt. I wasn't just mad at my parents. I was mad at myself for not noticing sooner, for letting them treat me like this. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the darkened windows of my house, trying to calm down. But the more I thought about it, the more the anger grew. I thought about the countless times I'd bent over backward to make them happy. The times I'd taken time off work to visit, even when it wasn't convenient. The times I'd bit my tongue during Greg's endless bragging, just to keep the peace. And for what? So they could cut me out of their lives like I didn't matter? My mind started racing through every memory of being the scapegoat in my family. Like the time in high school when Greg wrecked the car, and somehow it was my fault for distracting him. Or the time my parents gave him a down payment for a house while I was struggling to make rent, and their excuse was that he needed it more. And then there was the time Greg borrowed money from me, money I didn't really have to spare, promising he'd pay it back within a month. 3 years later, I was still waiting. My parents knew about it, but they told me to let it go because Greg was under a lot of pressure. As I sat there, staring at nothing, an idea started to form in my mind. It wasn't a fully developed plan, just a hint of something taking shape. If my family wanted to erase me, fine, but I wasn't going to make it easy for them. I thought about the files on my old laptop, the ones I'd kept just in case. They were mostly harmless. Old emails, screenshots of conversations, copies of documents. But buried in there were a few things I'd stumbled across over the years. Things my family wouldn't want anyone to know. Like the time Greg used his position at my dad's company to cut corners on a project, costing the company thousands. Or the time my mom accidentally emailed me a spreadsheet that showed some creative accounting she'd been doing at her job. I'd never planned to use any of it. Honestly, I kept it more out of spite than anything else. But now it felt like I finally had a reason. By the time I went inside, the idea had solidified into something more. I wasn't just going to let them cut me out and move on like nothing happened. If they wanted to treat me like I didn't exist, I was going to make sure they couldn't ignore me. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop, scrolling through the files I hadn't touched in years. My hands were still shaking, but this time it wasn't from anger. It was from adrenaline. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them walk away from this unscathed. I woke up the next morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't peace. Exactly, more like a sense of purpose. The anger from the night before was still there, bubbling under the surface, but it wasn't aimless anymore. I had a direction now, a plan starting to form in the back of my mind. This wasn't about revenge. That's what I kept telling myself. Anyway, revenge was petty, and I didn't want to stoop to their level. No, this was about something bigger. This was about justice, about balance, about showing my family exactly who they had underestimated. I pulled out my old laptop, the one I hadn't touched in ages, and powered it up. It took forever to boot, and the fan sounded like it was on its last legs, but eventually, the screen flickered to life. I felt a pang of nostalgia as I scrolled through the cluttered desktop, full of old folders with names like Random Stuff and Work Docs. Buried under the mess was a folder simply labeled Family. I clicked it open, and there it was, years of files I'd forgotten I even had. Screenshots of passive-aggressive texts from Greg. Emails from my mom, scolding me for not visiting enough. Scans of old documents my dad had asked me to keep, just in case. And then there were the juicier bits, the things I'd stumbled across by accident but never deleted. Like the time Greg had used company funds to buy himself a new set of golf clubs, labeling it as a business expense. Or the email chain, where my mom admitted to my dad that she'd fudged the numbers on her quarterly report at work to avoid getting reprimanded. I even had a photo of a handwritten note my dad had left on my desk years ago, instructing me to delete this conversation after he'd vented about some insider info he shouldn't have shared. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. I kept these things partly out of habit, partly out of a weird sense of self-preservation. My family had always been the type to hold grudges, and I'd learned early on that having receipts could save you in an argument. But now, as I scrolled through the files, I realized just how much power I was sitting on. This wasn't just petty dirt. This was evidence, real, undeniable proof that my family wasn't as perfect as they liked to pretend. They'd spent years acting like they were better than me, like I was the black sheep who didn't belong. But the truth? They were just as flawed, if not worse. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how blind I'd been. My family had always been about appearances, about maintaining this facade of success and unity. They'd thrown me under the bus more times than I could count, all in the name of keeping up that image. But now, I had the chance to show them what it felt like to be on the other side. I spent hours combing through the files, organizing them into folders and subfolders. I labeled each one with names like Greg's lies and Mom's numbers. I didn't know exactly how I was going to use them yet, but it felt good to see everything laid out in one place. At one point, I came across an old voicemail from Greg that I'd saved years ago. It was from the time he'd borrowed money from me, promising to pay it back as soon as possible. In the message, he'd gone on and on about how grateful he was, how I was the only one who really understood him. Listening to it now, I wanted to throw my laptop across the room. I thought about all the times I'd been there for Greg, the times I'd bailed him out of trouble or covered for him when he messed up. And for what? So he could turn around and laugh in my face when our parents cut me out of the will? The anger flared up again, but this time it wasn't overwhelming. It was focused, sharp. By the time I was done, I had a comprehensive archive of every shady, selfish, or downright cruel thing my family had done. But just having the files wasn't enough. I needed a way to make them feel the weight of it, to make them see what they'd done to me and to each other. That's when I remembered the Christmas newsletter. Every year, my mom sent out a long, flowery email to all our relatives and family friends, detailing the highlights of our lives. It was always full of exaggerations and half-truths. How Greg was thriving in his career, how my parents were the picture of marital bliss, how I was finding my way, a polite way of saying they didn't know what I was doing. The idea hit me like a bolt of lightning. What if this year's newsletter wasn't written by my mom? What if it came from me? And what if it wasn't full of fluff? I started drafting it right then and there. I kept the tone cheerful and upbeat, just like my mom's newsletters, but the content was anything but. Dear family and friends, I wrote, this year has been a truly eye-opening one for our family. We've all had our ups and downs, but we've learned so much about each other along the way. In the spirit of transparency, I wanted to share some highlights from the year that you might not have heard about. Then I started listing everything. Greg's shady business dealings, my mom's accounting tricks, my dad's whispered secrets. I included just enough detail to make it clear I wasn't bluffing, but not so much that it felt like overkill. I ended the draft with a cheerful closing. Here's to a new year full of honesty and growth. Wishing you all the best. My name. When I was done, I sat back and stared at the screen. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from anger or adrenaline. It was from the sheer weight of what I was about to do. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about showing my family exactly who they were, flawed, selfish, and far from perfect. And if they couldn't accept me for who I was, then they didn't deserve the privilege of pretending they were any better. I saved the draft and closed the laptop. For the first time in days, I felt a strange sense of calm. My plan wasn't perfect yet, but it was coming together. And when it was done, I knew it would be something they'd never forget. The following week became a strange mix of therapy and strategy. Each morning, I'd sit at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, my old laptop, and a notepad. I knew that if I was going to go through with this, it had to be done right. Half measures wouldn't cut it. I wanted this letter to be more than just a momentary sting. I wanted it to stick. It started with an outline. I wrote down every major incident, every time someone in my family had done something shady, manipulative, or outright cruel. At first, the list felt like overkill. Did I really want to air all of this? But then I thought about how they had excluded me from their future without a second thought. They hadn't hesitated to hurt me, so why was I hesitating now? The more I wrote, the more I remembered. There were the obvious things, like Greg's questionable business deals that everyone in the family quietly ignored because he brought in money. But there were smaller things, too, like how my mom had pressured me into covering for her at work when she'd screwed up a major report, then never thanked me. Or how my dad once told me, in a moment of frustration, that I wasn't cut out for the real world. I decided the letter would be styled like one of my mom's holiday newsletters, down to the cheerful tone and overly detailed anecdotes. Dear family and friends, I began just like my mom always did. This year has been a truly unforgettable one for the family last name household. We've all had some incredible experiences and learned so much about each other. I thought it would be fun to share a few highlights from our year. The next part was the hardest, striking the right balance between exposing the truth and keeping it subtle enough to let the details speak for themselves. I didn't want it to come across as bitter or angry. That would give him an easy excuse to dismiss me as emotional or vindictive. No, this had to feel calm, controlled, and undeniable. For Greg, I started with, Greg has been busy as ever with his entrepreneurial pursuits. Between juggling multiple projects and expanding his portfolio, he even found time to test the limits of what constitutes a business expense. Golf clubs, anyone? I followed it up with a more direct hit. It's been amazing to watch Greg navigate the complex world of business ethics, or as he calls it, creative problem solving. We're so proud of how he's managed to keep things under wraps. Not everyone could pull off what he's done with those construction contracts. For my mom, I leaned into her work mishap from a few years ago, the one she thought was long forgotten. Mom continues to thrive in her career, even managing to stay calm under pressure when a small accounting error almost escalated into a major issue. Of course, we all learned a valuable lesson about the importance of double-checking spreadsheets. It's a good thing she had some help smoothing things over, though I'll let her share those details herself. And for my dad, I didn't hold back. Dad has been his usual rock-solid self, always providing guidance and wisdom when we need it. I'll never forget the heartfelt advice he gave me about the importance of discretion after sharing some insider info from work that I wasn't supposed to know. His trust in me really made me feel special. Once I had the main body of the letter done, I turned my attention to the piece de resistance, the attachments. I dug through my files and printed out everything I had. Copies of emails, screenshots of texts, even a few scanned documents with Greg's signature in all the wrong places. I slipped each piece of evidence into a separate envelope, labeling them clearly so there'd be no confusion. One for Greg, one for my mom, one for my dad. The main letter was printed on thick, glossy paper, the kind my mom always used for her newsletters, and I signed it at the bottom with a cheerful, "Wishing you all the best, my name." Finally, I packaged it all together in a large, festive red envelope. I tied it with a gold ribbon for good measure and labeled it simply, "To the family." It looked harmless, even cheerful, just another Christmas tradition. I spent the rest of the day staring at the envelope, second-guessing myself. Was this too much? Was I crossing a line I couldn't uncross? A part of me wanted to rip it all up and forget the whole thing. But then I thought about Greg's smirk when my dad announced they'd cut me out of the will. I thought about my mom's silence, the way she couldn't even look me in the eye. I thought about the years of being treated like an afterthought, like I didn't belong. This wasn't revenge, I reminded myself. This was accountability. With that thought in mind, I grabbed my coat and the envelope and headed out. I wasn't sure what the fallout would be, but one thing was certain. They'd never forget this Christmas. The morning of Christmas felt heavier than it should have. Normally, I'd wake up to the soft hum of holiday music from the radio and the smell of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven, my small personal tradition. But this year, the air in my house felt thick with doubt. I sat at the kitchen table, the red envelope in my hands, turning it over and over. Was I really going to go through with this? It wasn't just about the fallout. I knew there'd be plenty of that, but also about what this said about me. Was I any better than them if I delivered this letter? The doubts were loud, persistent. But every time I thought about chickening out, I remembered their faces from that night. My dad's dismissive tone, my mom's averted gaze, Greg's smug smirk. The way they'd blindsided me without a shred of guilt. They'd made their choice, and now it was time for me to make mine. By the time I left for my parents' house, the envelope was tucked under my arm, tied neatly with its little gold ribbon. My mind was racing with every possible outcome, but I kept telling myself this wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up for myself. When I pulled into their driveway, the scene was exactly what I'd expected. My parents' house looked like a Christmas card, complete with twinkling lights and a perfectly adorned wreath on the door. Inside, the sounds of holiday music and the clinking of glasses filled the air. Greg's obnoxious laugh was the first thing I heard when I stepped inside. He was already holding court in the living room, surrounded by our parents and a glass of wine in hand. "Ah, there she is," he said when he spotted me, flashing that trademark smirk. "We were starting to think you wouldn't show." I forced a smile and shrugged off my coat. "Wouldn't miss it," I said, keeping my tone light. The atmosphere was exactly what I'd expected. My parents fawned over Greg like he was the golden child, asking about his latest business ventures and laughing at his not-so-funny jokes. I stayed quiet for the most part, playing the role of the dutiful daughter who didn't want to rock the boat. Dinner was a surreal experience. The table was piled high with the usual holiday fare: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, but it all felt tasteless to me. The conversation was equally bland, full of the same empty pleasantries we'd been exchanging for years. Greg, of course, dominated the discussion. He went on and on about some big investment opportunity he was pursuing, dropping names and figures like he was trying to impress everyone. My parents ate it up, nodding and smiling like proud parents at a school play. "Sounds impressive," I said at one point, unable to resist a hint of sarcasm. Greg gave me a sideways glance, his smirk flickering for just a moment before he recovered. After dinner, we moved to the living room for presents. My mom handed out the gifts as usual, narrating each one like it was a major event. Greg's pile was noticeably larger than mine, but that wasn't a surprise. It had been that way for years. I waited until the last gift was opened, until the room was quiet and everyone was basking in the glow of another perfect Christmas. Then, I stood up and picked up the red envelope from where I'd hidden it under my chair. "This is for all of you," I said, holding it out. My voice was steady calm. My mom was the first to reach for it, her face lighting up with curiosity. "Oh, how thoughtful. What is it?" "Just something I put together," I said casually, sitting back down and crossing my legs. "I thought it'd be nice to reflect on the year we've had." She untied the ribbon and pulled out the letter, her smile faltering as she started to read. My dad leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowing as he scanned the page. Greg, still nursing his glass of wine, looked on with mild disinterest, until my mom let out a small gasp. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Keep reading," I said, folding my hands in my lap. The room grew quieter as they read, the festive atmosphere evaporating like smoke. My dad's face turned red, his jaw tightening with every line. Greg snatched the letter from my mom halfway through, his eyes narrowing as he skimmed it. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Just some highlights from the year," I said with a shrug. I figured it was time we all got on the same page. Greg's face was a mix of anger and panic. "You're out of your mind," he said, tossing the letter onto the coffee table like it was poison. "This is slander." "It's the truth," I shot back, my calm veneer starting to crack. "You can call it whatever you want, but we both know it's true." My dad stood up, his hands clenched into fists. "You had no right," he said, his voice low and furious. "This is our family business. You don't air dirty laundry like this." "Oh, you mean the way you trusted me enough to cut me out of the will without even telling me why?" I snapped, finally letting some of my anger show. "You made it clear I wasn't part of this family anymore. So why should I care about protecting your secrets?" My mom was crying now, her hands shaking as she tried to gather up the letter and the documents I'd included. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Because you left me no choice," I said, my voice steady again. "You wanted to erase me from this family? Fine. But I wasn't going to let you do it without seeing exactly who you are." The room was silent for a long moment, the tension so thick it felt like it could snap. Greg was the first to break it, storming out of the room with a string of curses under his breath. My dad followed, muttering something about cleaning up this mess. My mom just sat there, clutching the letter and staring at the floor. I stayed a little longer, letting the silence settle. I wasn't sure what I'd accomplished, but one thing was certain. They'd never forget this Christmas. The moment they opened the letter, I knew I had their attention. It started innocently enough. My mom unfolded the glossy paper with her usual meticulousness, holding it up to read aloud. "Dear family and friends," she began, her tone bright and cheery, as if she were reciting one of her own newsletters. My dad leaned forward in his seat, his brow furrowing slightly as he followed along. Greg, lounging on the couch with a glass of wine in hand, barely glanced at the paper. "Let me guess," he said with a smirk. "Some passive-aggressive guilt trip about how we're all too busy to appreciate the holidays properly?" I didn't respond. I just sat back and waited. At first, their reactions were subdued. My mom's expression shifted from cheerful to puzzled as she read the first few lines. My dad tilted his head, his frown deepening. Greg, oblivious, chuckled under his breath. "What is this supposed to be?" my mom asked, lowering the paper to look at me. Her voice was light, but there was an edge of uncertainty in it. "It's all in the letter," I said simply. She turned back to the page, and as her eyes moved down the text, I saw the exact moment it hit her. Her lips parted in a silent gasp, and her hands trembled slightly. My dad leaned over to see what she was reading, his face quickly darkening. Greg, still clueless, snatched the paper from her, and skimmed it with a cocky grin. "Oh, come on," he said, laughing. "What's this? A roast? Did you hire a ghostwriter for this one?" But the laughter didn't last. The further Greg read, the more his smirk faded. By the time he reached the section about his creative business expenses, his face had turned pale. He glanced up at me, his eyes narrowing. "Where the hell did you get this?" I didn't answer. My dad took the letter next, reading it in tense silence. With every passing second, his expression grew angrier. His jaw clenched, his face reddened, and by the time he finished, his hands were balled into fists. "This is outrageous," he said, his voice low and dangerous. My mom, meanwhile, was sifting through the documents I'd included, her face a mixture of disbelief and panic. "Where did you get these?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "I told you," I said calmly. "It's all in the letter." The room fell silent except for the sound of papers shuffling as they frantically reread and cross-checked what I'd written. My dad's face was a storm of anger and frustration. My mom looked like she might cry, and Greg looked like he was ready to explode. "This is slander," Greg spat, throwing the letter onto the coffee table. "You're making this shit up. None of this is real." I raised an eyebrow. "You think I'd go through all this trouble just to lie? Everything in that letter is backed up by the documents, right in front of you." My dad pointed a trembling finger at me. "You had no right to do this. These are private matters, family matters. You don't just air dirty laundry like this." "Family matters?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You mean like how you all decided to cut me out of the will without even telling me why? Like how you've spent years treating me like I don't belong? If that's what family means to you, then maybe you need to take a closer look at yourselves." My mom finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't mean to hurt you. My name. We thought this was the best way to handle things." "The best way to handle things?" I repeated, incredulous. "By erasing me from your lives? By pretending I don't matter?" Greg snorted, crossing his arms. "Oh, spare us the sob story. You're just bitter because you didn't get your way. This is all about money, isn't it?" I laughed bitterly. "You think this is about money?" "Greg, I couldn't care less about the money. This is about the principle. About how you all decided I wasn't worth being part of this family anymore." My dad slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. "Enough," he barked. "This isn't going anywhere. You made your point. My name. Now take your damn letter and get out." I stood my ground, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "No, you don't get to dismiss me like that. Not this time." For a moment, no one said anything. The room was filled with an unbearable tension, the kind that made it hard to breathe. My mom stared at the floor, Greg glared at me, and my dad looked like he was about to erupt. Finally, I broke the silence. "You wanted to cut me out, fine. But you don't get to rewrite history. You don't get to act like you're the perfect family while sweeping everything under the rug. I'm done being the scapegoat, and I'm done pretending this doesn't hurt." I grabbed my coat and turned to leave, pausing at the door to look back at them one last time. "Merry Christmas," I said, my voice heavy with sarcasm. And with that, I walked out, leaving them to deal with the mess I dropped in their laps. As I drove home, I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. If anything, I felt hollow. But I knew one thing for sure. They'd never look at me, or themselves, the same way again. When I woke up the next morning, I half expected a flurry of angry texts or missed calls. Instead, my phone was eerily silent, as if the calm before the storm had settled in. For a brief moment, I thought maybe they decided to let it go, to just stew in their own mess and leave me out of it. But by noon, the first text came in. It was from Greg, of course. It read, "You're a real piece of work, you know that?" Short, direct, and seething with the kind of anger that only comes from someone realizing their carefully constructed world is cracking. I ignored it. Then came a call from my dad. I hesitated for a moment before answering, bracing myself for what I knew was going to be a one-sided tirade. "My name, what were you thinking?" He started, his voice sharp and clipped. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Enlighten me," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You've humiliated this family," he snapped. "That letter, those documents, it's completely out of line. What were you trying to accomplish? To destroy us? Destroy you?" I repeated, incredulous. "You really think I have that kind of power? If the truth is enough to destroy you, maybe you should take a closer look at yourselves." He let out a harsh laugh. "You don't understand the position you've put us in. Your mother is beside herself. Greg is furious. And He cut himself off, and I could hear him take a deep breath, like he was trying to rein himself in. "You're what?" I pressed. "Disappointed? Embarrassed? Angry that I finally stood up to you?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that made my stomach twist. Then he said, his voice quieter now, "I'm angry that you would betray your family like this." The word betray stung more than I wanted to admit, but I wasn't about to back down. Betrayal? I shot back. That's rich, coming from the man who cut me out of the will without so much as a conversation, who sat there and let Greg mock me while Mom pretended not to notice. You want to talk about betrayal? How about the years I've spent being treated like I don't matter? He started to say something, but I cut him off. No, you don't get to make me feel bad about this. You made your choices, Dad. All of you did. And now you're dealing with the consequences. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. You've made your point, my name. I hope you're satisfied. He hung up before I could respond. The next blow came in the form of a voicemail from my mom. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell she'd been crying. My name, please, can we just talk about this? I don't understand why you felt the need to do this. It's tearing us apart. Your father hasn't spoken to me all morning, and Greg, well, you know how he is. Please call me back. I just want to understand. Hearing her like that tugged at something deep in me. For all her flaws, my mom had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to smooth things over even when it meant ignoring the real problems. A part of me wanted to call her back, to try to explain myself, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. She didn't want the truth. She wanted everything to go back to the way it was. And then there was Greg. He didn't bother with voicemails or heartfelt pleas. Instead, he bombarded me with text messages, each one angrier than the last. You're pathetic. Do you really think this makes you look good? Good luck ever showing your face at a family event again. By the third message, I stopped reading them. Greg had always been a bully, but now that his perfect image was under threat, he was lashing out harder than ever. It was almost comical, in a way, how predictable he was. The real blowback, though, came later that evening. I was sitting on the couch, half watching some forgettable Christmas movie, when my phone buzzed with a new email notification. It was from my dad's lawyer. The subject line read, "Immediate family matter." My heart sank as I opened the email. It was formal, cold, and to the point. Dear my name, it has come to our attention that you have distributed private and potentially defamatory information regarding members of your family. Please be advised that this matter may have legal consequences if further action is deemed necessary. We strongly urge you to cease and desist from any additional dissemination of such materials. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting in knots. Of course my dad would try to scare me into submission. That was his way, control through intimidation. But this time it wasn't going to work. The next morning I sent my own email to my dad, my mom, and Greg. Let's get one thing straight, I wrote. What I shared wasn't defamatory. It was the truth. And if you think dragging lawyers into this is going to scare me, think again. I've spent my entire life walking on eggshells around this family, trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. Well, I'm done. You wanted me out of your lives, and now you've got what you wanted. But don't think for a second that you can silence me or rewrite history. The truth is out there now, and you're going to have to live with it. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. For the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand. For the first few days, the silence was deafening. After the initial burst of anger and frantic messages, everything went eerily quiet. I wasn't sure if they were regrouping, giving me the silent treatment, or simply didn't know how to respond. A part of me hoped they were sitting in that big house of theirs, replaying my words, questioning themselves. But deep down, I knew my family too well. Self-reflection wasn't exactly their strong suit. Still, the quiet gave me space to think. It felt strange, almost surreal, to have finally stood up to them. For so long, I'd been the family doormat, the one who nodded and smiled while everyone else talked over me. Now, for the first time, I felt like I'd taken control of my own narrative. The first crack into silence came on the third day. My phone rang just as I was getting out of the shower. I glanced at the screen and saw my dad's name flashing. For a moment, I debated whether to answer. I could already imagine the tone of the conversation. Calm on the surface, but laced with the same condescension he'd always used when trying to fix things. I let it go to voicemail. The notification popped up a few seconds later, and curiosity got the better of me. My name, he began, his voice as measured as ever. I've been thinking about everything you said, and I believe we need to have a conversation. Face to face. There are things we need to clear up, and I think it's important for all of us to move forward. I could practically hear the effort it took him to keep his voice steady. He didn't say the words, "I'm sorry," but the underlying tone of frustration, mixed with unease, told me enough. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, and it was throwing him off his game. Later that evening, Greg texted me. Unlike my dad's carefully measured voicemail, his message was pure venom. You're seriously out of control. Do you even realize what you've done? You're tearing this family apart. I hope you're happy. I laughed out loud when I read it, a short, bitter sound that echoed through my empty living room. Tearing the family apart? As if I'd been the one who decided to cut ties in the first place. I didn't bother replying. The next day my mom called. Her voicemail was different, soft, pleading, almost desperate. My name. I don't know what to say, she began, her voice trembling. I never wanted things to be this way. I don't understand why you felt like you had to go so far. Please, can we just talk? I'm begging you. We need to fix this. Hearing her like that was harder than I expected. For all her flaws, my mom had always been the one who tried to keep the family together, even if it meant ignoring the cracks in the foundation. A part of me wanted to call her back, to explain my side of things, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. She wasn't ready to hear the truth. Not really. By the end of the week, the messages started piling up. Some were angry, others were apologetic, and a few were just plain confusing. My dad sent me an email outlining steps we could take to resolve the situation, complete with bullet points and a suggested timeline. Greg doubled down on his insults, calling me spiteful and pathetic. My mom alternated between begging for reconciliation and quietly blaming me for the fallout. But I didn't respond to any of them. Not because I didn't care. If anything, their messages stirred up emotions I wasn't ready to face. But I wasn't looking for an apology or a resolution. That had never been the point. What I needed, was for them to feel the weight of their actions. For once in their lives, they needed to understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end of their decisions. I spent a lot of time thinking about what came next. Cutting ties completely was an option, one I considered more than once. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I was ready for that. As much as they'd hurt me, they were still my family. Letting go of that connection, flawed as it was, felt like tearing out a part of myself. Instead, I decided to set boundaries, real ones, the kind I'd never had before. No more pretending everything was fine for the sake of keeping the peace. No more bending over backward to earn their approval. From now on, I'd dictate the terms of our relationship. By the end of the week, the calls and messages started to taper off. It seemed like they'd finally realized I wasn't going to budge, that no amount of guilt-tripping or arguing was going to change what I'd done. I knew they'd never fully understand the damage they'd caused, and that was okay. This wasn't about changing them, it was about taking control of my own life. Whether they admitted it or not, I knew one thing for sure. They'd think twice before treating me like an outsider again. In the weeks following that Christmas, the dust began to settle. The initial shock and anger from my family seemed to fade, replaced by an uneasy silence. It wasn't peace. Nothing about this situation felt peaceful, but it was a kind of stillness. I'd expected to feel a sense of triumph, some cathartic release after finally standing up for myself. But what I felt was complicated. The truth is, I'm not proud of what I did. Crafting that letter, exposing all those secrets, it wasn't my finest moment. And yet, I don't regret it. They had pushed me to a breaking point, and I finally pushed back. For the first time in my life, I'd refused to stay quiet, refused to let them rewrite my place in the family. And even though it wasn't pretty, I knew it was necessary. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding the parts of my life that had nothing to do with my family. It was harder than I thought it would be. For all their flaws, my parents and Greg had been a constant presence in my life, even if it wasn't always a supportive one. Their absence left a strange void, one I wasn't sure how to fill. I threw myself into work, taking on projects I'd been putting off for months. I started reconnecting with old friends, people I'd drifted away from over the years while trying to keep up with my family's demands. For the first time in ages, I started making decisions that were entirely my own, without worrying about how they'd be received by anyone else. It wasn't easy. Setting boundaries never is. But it felt good, liberating even. My family reached out a few times in the weeks after Christmas, though their attempts were sporadic and awkward. My dad sent me an email with the subject line, "Rebuilding Trust," which was exactly as dry and formal as it sounds. He wrote about re-establishing open communication and mutual respect, as if we were colleagues working through a difficult business deal. I read the email 3 times before deciding not to respond. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew it wasn't enough. Words were easy. My dad had always been good at saying the right thing when it suited him. What I needed was action, and I wasn't going to settle for less. Greg, on the other hand, took a different approach. His messages were a mix of half-hearted apologies and barely veiled insults. One text read, "Look, I'm sorry things got so messy, but you have to admit you went a little overboard." Another simply said, "Are you done being dramatic yet?" I didn't respond to him either. The hardest one to ignore was my mom. She called a few times, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to accusatory. One day, she'd be begging me to come home for dinner, promising that we could work through this. The next, she'd leave a message saying, "I just don't understand why you're doing this to us. My name? We're family." I wanted to believe her sincerity, but I knew better. My mom had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to smooth things over without addressing the root of the problem. She didn't want to fix what was broken. She just wanted everything to look good on the surface again. For now, I wasn't willing to play along. The real turning point came a few weeks later, when I received a letter in the mail. It was from my dad, handwritten on his personal stationery. That alone caught me off guard. My dad wasn't exactly the sentimental type, and the last time he'd written me a letter was probably when I was in elementary school. The letter was short and surprisingly vulnerable. "I know I've made mistakes," he wrote. "I know we've all made mistakes. But I want you to know that no matter what, you're still my daughter, and I'm still your father. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I hope you'll give me the chance to make things right." It wasn't perfect. It didn't erase the years of hurt or the decisions that had led to this point. But it was a start. Since then, things have been tentative. I've spoken to my mom a few times, though our conversations are careful and surface level. Greg hasn't reached out again, and honestly, I'm okay with that. My dad and I exchanged a few emails, nothing too deep, but enough to keep the lines of communication open. I've thought a lot about cutting ties completely, about walking away from the family that had caused me so much pain. But for now, I've decided to keep my distance instead. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I do know one thing. They know where I stand, and I know where I stand with them. That Christmas wasn't about revenge, no matter how it might have seemed. It wasn't about getting even or proving a point. It was about something bigger, about standing up for myself in a way I'd never been able to before. The best gift I gave that year wasn't the letter or the documents or the chaos that followed. It was the realization that I don't need their approval to feel whole. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing myself. And honestly, that's a gift I plan to keep giving every year from now on.